The image that won't leave me is small and strangely bright. A scuffed plastic shell half buried in wet leaves. Rainwater beads on it, catching pale light filtering through fir branches. A red dot blinks behind a film of condensation, steady and patient, like an eye that refuses to close. There's mud streaked across the vents, a bit of fern pressed against the strap, and the slow drip of water from a branch above tapping the casing with a hollow plastic tick. The air around it is cool and still that deep forest chill that smells like wet earth and cedar bark. You can hear distant road noise, just a faint hum, and a bird calling somewhere you can't see. The helmet sits there on its side, recording nothing but an empty stretch of ditch and the shadows sliding across the ground long after anyone who wore it has moved out of frame. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. My name is Rachel, and for a long time our life in Lincoln City moved with the same quiet rhythm as the tide. Most mornings started before the sun really showed itself, with the gray light leaking around the blinds and the distant sound of waves pushing against the sand a few blocks away. I'd hear the kettle start to rattle on the stove, the faint hiss as water heated, and the soft creak of the old floorboards in our kitchen as Lucas moved back and forth in cycling socks. The air in the apartment always held a mix of coffee, sea salt, and the citrus-scented detergent he insisted on using for his jerseys. He liked the mornings like that, cool, blank, and predictable. He'd say it was easier to measure progress when the rest of the world was still half asleep. By April, the town was easing out of winter, but not yet flooded with summer tourists. The streets stayed quiet until mid-morning when the small cafes opened and the smell of bacon and pancakes started drifting out over wet sidewalks. You could hear the gulls before you saw them circling above the rooftops and arguing over scraps behind the diner on the corner. Down by the water, the fog sat low, a soft gray band over the ocean that made everything feel closer and smaller than it really was. Locals drove a little slower that time of year, tires hissing on damp pavement wipers squeaking across windshields, everyone still shaking off the dark days of winter. It was a time when you noticed details, steam rising from manhole covers, the chill that found its way through your sweater, the way the light stayed gentle all morning instead of turning sharp. Our apartment was on the second floor of a tired blue duplex close enough to the coast that the windows fogged on their own some mornings. If you ran your hand along the glass, you'd come away with a line of cool moisture and the faint smell of salt and old paint. The living room doubled as our gear room. One corner held yoga mats and blocks stacked neatly, and the other was dominated by Lucas's bike. He kept it spotless, even in the off-season black carbon frame, wiped down chain-oiled tires, checked with a precise thumb press that made a soft, rubbery squeak. He'd lean over it like a mechanic over a race car, shoulders, relaxed eyes, quietly focused. Everything about him slowing down when his hands were on that bike. When he wasn't riding, he was talking about riding, editing footage at the small kitchen table while the laptop fan hummed and the glow of the screen lit his face in the dim room. Lucas had rules for himself, and one of the most important was simple: never ride alone into the hills without letting someone know exactly where he was going. He treated that rule like a ritual, not an inconvenience. The night before a big ride, he'd pull up the route on his phone, tracing the lines on the screen with a fingertip, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. He'd murmur to himself about gradients and elevation like he was reading a bedtime story only he understood. He'd send the link to me and to his mom in Montana, then double-check that the tracking app was set to share his location. Redundancy, he'd say, grinning as he tested the helmet camera and its little status light. If I vanish, at least I'll leave a breadcrumb trail. I would roll my eyes at the joke, but there was always a small tug in my chest when he said it, like a string being pulled from somewhere I couldn't see. His mother, Carol, had embraced the role of distant watcher. Her house in Missoula might have been hundreds of miles away, but her phone lit up every time he started a ride. She'd sit there at her kitchen table. She told me, a cup of tea in her hands, watching that little moving dot while the morning sun came in through the window and caught the steam rising from her mug. Lucas laughed about it, called her his air traffic control, but he never once asked her to stop. Even through the phone, I could hear the tension in her breathing when the signal dropped for a moment in a valley, the way her voice eased when it came back. She knew the sound of wind over the microphone on his helmet, the pattern of his long climbs, the pauses he took at overlooks where you could hear nothing but quiet air and a faint rush of water down below. Our days revolved around small routines that felt ordinary at the time. I taught yoga in a studio above a hardware store, a long room that smelled of wood polish and old carpet with big windows that looked out over the main street. The traffic sounds were soft delivery trucks backing up with that familiar beeping. Someone's radio leaking classic rock into the air, the buzz of a neon open sign flickering to life across the street. Between classes, I'd wipe down mats while listening to the muffled thump of rain on the roof, or on clearer days, the distant boom of waves hitting the beach. Lucas worked remotely hunched over his laptop at our kitchen table, fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the keys, the glow of code reflecting off his glasses. He'd break up his day with short spinouts, as he called them, quick loops up the highway, and back coming home with his cheeks flushed and a faint sheen of sweat still cooling on his forearms. At night, when we both finally landed on the couch, the apartment would settle into that comfortable hum of small appliances and distant traffic. The refrigerator would kick on, making a low buzzing sound under the clink of ice shifting in the freezer. The street lamp outside our window threw a cone of yellow light that caught the dust in the air whenever we opened the curtains. We'd watch his old ride videos sometimes, not because they were particularly dramatic, but because he liked studying them. He'd point out where he took a corner too wide, or where the light through the trees looked especially beautiful the way it striped the pavement in moving shadows. I'd mostly watch him instead of the footage, how his shoulders loosened the second the road appeared on screen, how his voice softened when he talked about the climb up to the lookout as if it were an old friend. The Coast Range had its own personality, and everyone who lived there understood it. The mountains weren't towering peaks so much as layered ridges heavy with fir and spruce rising out of the mist like dark shoulders. On clear days you could see the line where the forest ended and the sky began a pale blue cut by dark green. On most days, though, clouds hung low and the light filtered through in patches, turning the moss on tree trunks into something that glowed softly like it was lit from within. The air up there cooled quickly once you left town. You could feel it on your face as you drove inland, like passing through a curtain from damp salt air to colder, sharper forest air. Lucas would talk about that shift like it was a welcome sign, a moment when the rest of the world fell away, and it was just him, the bike, and the steady rhythm of his breathing. He loved that one particular road, Old Salmon River Road, more than any gym, any race course, any manicured city trail. It wasn't a place for beginners. The pavement was rough in spots, patched in others, the kind of surface that made a distinct buzzing sound under thin road tires. The road wound along the river before climbing in tight curves toward the headland's trees leaning overhead, so their branches nearly knit together. If you pulled over and turned off your engine, you could hear the water moving over rocks, a low, constant rushing beneath the occasional crack of a branch and the soft rustle of the canopy. Even from the passenger seat, you felt how lonely it was out there. No houses, no street lights, just the endless damp smell of earth and pine needles, and the sense that the forest had been there long before you and would remain long after. Lucas respected that road, and he liked to remind me of it. In the weeks leading up to mid-April, he'd mention the weather like he was negotiating with it. At the breakfast table, he'd check the forecast, watching the little icons of clouds and sun, the predicted wind speeds and temperatures. 2, maybe 3 more good days before the rain really settles in, he'd say, tapping the screen with a fingertip while the toaster clicked behind him. He'd talk about needing one last long climb before he switched to more indoor training. His voice light, but his eyes focused. Every time he mentioned one last ride, something about the wording snagged at me like catching your sleeve on a nail you didn't see in the wall. I brushed it off the way you do with small, nameless worries that don't have a reason to exist yet. People in town knew Lucas as the bike guy, even if they didn't know his name. The barista at the coffee shop always had his order started by the time he reached the counter on Saturday mornings, handing him a paper cup warm enough to fog his glasses. The mechanic at the small gas station on the edge of town would lean on the doorframe and squint at his bike when he rolled by, offering unsolicited advice about tires and brakes. Even Officer Hensley, who sometimes parked his patrol car near the beach to do paperwork, would nod at Lucas when he saw him ride past the reflective stripes on his jersey catching the weak afternoon light. There was a comfort in that, seeing familiar faces, hearing the same greetings from the same voices, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clang of a gas pump nozzle, the soft scratch of a pen in a ticket book. It made the town feel smaller than it looked on a map, like we were all part of the same quiet routine. At home, the only tension between us and his riding came from how much of our schedule bent around the weather and the mountains. We'd plan dinners, movie nights, and weekend trips around the days he needed for long climbs. Our calendar on the fridge had small arrows drawn on it, marking big rides, each one outlined in blue pen. There were times when I wished we could just sleep in, instead let the morning pass without anyone checking a forecast or a battery level. But then I'd watch him lay out his gear the night before, a ride the neatly folded jersey, the padded shorts, the tiny packets of energy gel lined up on the counter. He'd move with such intent, the soft smack of fabric against the table, the click of the helmet straps as he checked them, the little beep of the camera powering on and off. It was like watching someone pack for a pilgrimage they'd been waiting all week to take. The night before that last big climb in April felt ordinary from the outside. The rain had backed off, leaving the streets dark and slick streetlights glowing in the puddles like melted gold. We had pasta for dinner, the smell of garlic and tomato sauce hanging in the warm kitchen, while the window over the sink fogged from the steam. We talked about small things, a student in my morning class who kept mixing up left and right a bug in the code he'd finally fixed after hours of staring at the same lines. He checked his route one more time at the table, the blue line on his phone tracing the same climb he'd done so many times before. I remember the pale glow of the screen on his face and the soft tap of his finger as he zoomed in on the switchbacks like a kid admiring a favorite trail on a worn-out map. When we finally went to bed, the apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of the ocean. I lay there listening to the rhythm of his breathing, feeling the warmth of his arm against mine, the faint scratch of stubble on my shoulder when he shifted. Somewhere outside, a car rolled by slowly, tires whispering over wet pavement, then faded into the night. I remember thinking it was one of those nights where sleep feels heavy and kind, where nothing is sharp enough to hurt. I didn't know that my mind was filing away the sound of his breathing, the weight of his hand on my back, the exact temperature of the air in the room. I didn't know those details would become anchors I'd cling to later, when everything else felt loose. Before dawn, the alarm on his phone chimed softly, a mellow tone instead of a harsh beep. The room was cold, the kind of chill that makes you pull the blanket up to your chin while the window glass sits slick with condensation. I heard the sheets rustle as he slipped out of bed, his bare feet making that soft, familiar sound on the hardwood floor. The smell of coffee started to drift down the short hallway a few minutes later, cutting through the salt and the faint mustiness of the old building. I stayed in bed longer than usual, eyes closed, listening to the tiny sounds of his routine. The clink of a spoon, the quiet thud of a cabinet closing, the muted click of cycling cleats as he tested them once or twice on the mat by the door. When I finally stepped into the kitchen, he was already halfway suited up. Yellow jersey, bright even in the dull gray light helmet resting on the table beside his phone. He smiled when he saw me, that easy, tired smile people wear when they're awake before the rest of the world. His hands were warm when he reached for me, smelling faintly of coffee and the rubber grip of his handlebars. We talked in low voices, so we wouldn't break the softness of the morning, the kind of hushed conversation that makes the whole apartment feel like it's still dreaming. He pointed once more at the route on his phone, the blue line curling into the hills, and I nodded, even though I already knew it by heart. When he finally stepped out the door, the air that rushed in around him was cold and damp, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and distant surf. I watched him walk his bike down the stairs, the faint tap of his cleats echoing in the stairwell, and then saw the bright flash of his jersey as he rolled out into the gray street. I stood there a moment longer than usual, hand on the doorframe, feeling the cool wood under my palm. The hallway behind me was dim, and still the only sound the low buzz of our refrigerator and the soft tick of the kitchen clock. Outside, the town was barely awake. No cars yet, no voices, just the faint whisper of the ocean and the distant murmur of wind in the trees up on the ridge. I flipped on the porch light out of habit, even though the morning had already begun to lighten, and watched its pale glow puddle on the damp concrete. Then I closed the door and stood in the quiet kitchen listening to a silence that felt, for reasons I couldn't name, just a little heavier than it should have. The first sign that the day was slipping off its rails came quietly the way trouble usually does. I was finishing a late morning class when I noticed the faint vibration in my bag, a call I hadn't felt earlier. The studio still smelled of sandalwood spray and warm bodies moving through stretches, and for a moment I thought it might be a wrong number, or one of my students asking about a schedule change. When I pulled out my phone, the screen showed a missed call from Carol, followed by 2 more. All within the last half hour. I remember staring at her name and feeling that thin thread of unease tighten in my stomach. It was too early for her to be checking on anything. She usually waited until lunchtime to glance at the tracking app so she wouldn't hover, as she called it. I stepped out onto the narrow landing above the hardware store, the boards creaking under me, and dialed her back with the cool April air settling against the damp sweat on my arms. She answered before the first ring finished, her voice too sharp, too breathless for the time of day. She asked if I'd heard from Lucas. I told her I hadn't not, since he'd left in the gray light that morning, the smell of coffee still clinging to his clothes. She swallowed, and I could almost hear her steadying herself before she said that his ride data had frozen, just stopped. She'd tried calling him and it went straight to voicemail. At first I told myself it was nothing, a dead zone, a cold battery, a moment of interference up in the hills. "It happens," I said, my voice sounding thin even to me. But I could feel the cold draft curling through the wooden railing, sliding under my skin in a way the weather alone couldn't explain. She said she'd give it another hour. She asked me to call her if I heard from him. She kept apologizing for being nervous for bothering me during work. But even through the phone, I could hear the way her breathing kept catching at the ends of her sentences. Back inside the studio felt warmer than before, the air heavy from the afternoon heat kicking on. My students trickled out, chatting quietly, oblivious. I sat down on the edge of a mat and stared at my phone, waiting for the screen to light up with a message or call from him. It didn't. When noon rolled around, I drove home with the windows cracked, letting in the smell of wet cedar from the trees lining the side streets. Every red light felt longer than usual. Every passing car felt just a little too loud. I kept telling myself he was probably already on his way back, that maybe he'd stopped to take a picture or had misjudged his pace. But the road leading to our duplex felt unsettlingly still, like the whole neighborhood was listening for something it couldn't quite name. Inside the apartment, the air carried the faint warmth of the coffee he'd brewed before dawn. His empty mug still sat in the sink, dried rings of brown circling the bottom. His laptop was open on the table, the charger blinking softly. I told myself he'd come through the door any minute, sweaty and smiling, telling me some story about a hawk he'd seen circling over the ridge or a roadside deer that startled him. But noon slipped into early afternoon. The light coming through the blinds shifted to a duller shade. The house creaked once, a soft, expanding sound in the ceiling, and I found myself jumping like I'd heard a shout. When Carol called again, her voice sounded thinner, stretched tight with worry. She said the tracking app still showed the last point at the same spot. No updates, no movement. She'd tried calling his number again and again. Still voicemail. She'd called Dennis, who was now on his computer checking weather conditions. Logging roads, anything that might explain a dropped signal. I tried to sound reassuring, but words felt useless in my mouth. The silence inside the apartment pressed against my ears. I walked to the window and stared out at the dull street, hoping I'd see that flash of yellow jersey coming around the corner. The sidewalk stayed empty. I told her I'd drive toward the highway, see if maybe he'd had a flat and someone had given him a lift partway home. Even saying it out loud felt like grasping at thin air. I grabbed my keys, stepped outside, and locked the door with a strange sense of hesitation, as if leaving the apartment meant admitting he wasn't coming back before I returned. The air smelled like rain was close, that metallic cool edge that settles over the coastal towns just before clouds roll in. As I drove east, the trees blurred into dark green walls, and the road felt too wide, too empty. The deeper I went, the more the quiet thickened. I kept glancing at the shoulder, half expecting to see him sitting on a guardrail helmet in his lap, waiting. The miles slipped under the tires with nothing but the steady hum of the engine and the soft slap of wipers clearing the scattered mist. Near the point where his route should have still shown movement, I slowed down, pulled over, and stepped out onto the gravel. The forest air was colder here. It smelled of damp bark and the faint sweetness of moss. The wind rustled through the branches overhead with a low hiss. I listened for the click of a bike chain or the faint scrape of cleats on pavement. Nothing. Only the distant rush of the river hidden somewhere down the slope where the water tore past rocks in its own steady rhythm. I walked a few yards along the shoulder, scanning the narrow strip of gravel that drop into thick brush below. Nothing looked disturbed. No tracks, no tire marks, no flash of metal caught in the weeds. The longer I stood there, the more the silence pressed against me. The mountains always felt big, but that afternoon they felt endless, like they were swallowing sound, like they were swallowing time. When I drove back toward town, the dashboard clock kept nudging into later hours, and every minute made the knot in my stomach heavier. By the time I reached our street again, my hands were cold on the steering wheel, even with the heater running. The porch light had clicked on automatically, throwing a soft amber glow over the steps. I'd never noticed how lonely that light could look in the middle of the day. A few neighbors were out, an older couple watering their potted plants, a teenager skateboarding lazily down the sidewalk. Normal scenes, familiar sounds, but none of it felt normal. I couldn't shake the sense that something had cracked open somewhere out of sight. Something I hadn't seen, couldn't see. I walked back into the apartment, set my keys on the counter, and checked my phone. No messages. I called his number again, listening to the hollow rings echo through the tiny speaker, then the abrupt switch to voicemail. I didn't bother leaving another message. The sound of my own voice felt wrong in that moment. I sent him a text instead. One word, "Are you okay?" and stared at it, waiting for those 3 little dots to appear. They didn't. When Carol called again, I heard the shift the moment I picked up. She wasn't trying to be calm anymore. Her voice had that clipped, almost panicked edge that comes when fear has finally pushed through all the easy explanations. She said she was calling the police. She'd waited long enough. I told her I'd meet them if they came by. After we hung up, I paced the living room, the floorboards clicking under my heels, my breath shallow. Each sound in the apartment felt too sharp. The buzzing refrigerator, the faint ticking of the stove cooling the quiet whoosh of a car passing outside. I caught myself staring at the spot near the door where his shoes usually sat after a long ride. That empty patch of floor felt like a missing piece of a puzzle, something small but vital. The light from the window had dimmed again, softening the edges of the room until everything looked washed out. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. I went out to the porch and leaned against the railing. The evening air had cooled noticeably, that dampness settling in that promised rain before nightfall. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A screen door slammed shut. Somewhere beyond the houses, a gull let out a long, lonely cry. I wrapped my arms around myself and tried to breathe slowly. Then I heard a low rumble coming up the street, growing louder as it approached. a cruiser turned the corner headlights gliding over the wet pavement in long streaks of white. It rolled to a stop in front of our building, engine idling. The driver's door opened with a soft groan, and an officer stepped out, his footsteps heavy on the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment in the glow of the porch light, adjusting his hat, looking up toward where I stood. The world seemed to tighten around that single gesture, and in the space between one breath and the next, I understood that whatever was coming next would not be simple. The night the deputy stepped out of his cruiser, the world around us shifted, though it took me a few minutes to understand just how much. His boots made a soft crunch on the damp sidewalk, and the glow from the porch light caught the sheen on his jacket. He asked if he could come inside, and his voice was steady in that way law enforcement tries to be when they know they're carrying someone else's fear. Inside the apartment, he stood near the door hat in his hands, listening as I explained what we knew, how the ride data had cut off, how the calls went unanswered, how this was all unlike Lucas. He nodded slowly, jotting notes with a pen that clicked softly in the quiet room. When he stepped back out to call dispatch, I watched the red and blue reflections wash across the walls like slow-moving waves. That was the moment I realized we'd crossed into something else entirely. This was no longer a late return or a simple dead zone. Something larger had taken hold. By dawn, the street outside held the low hum of engines and the snap of radios. Patrol cars rolled in one by one, their headlights cutting through the morning fog that clung to the rooftops. The air smelled of wet pine and exhaust, a mix that settled heavily on my tongue. A sergeant introduced himself and explained they were treating this as a priority welfare check, the kind of phrase meant to soften the blow, but never succeeding. He asked for a recent photo, so I unlocked my phone with shaking fingers and handed it over. A small group of deputies gathered around the image Lucas in his yellow jersey leaning against his bike, the ocean behind him. They studied it with the kind of focus that made my chest tighten. I followed them outside where they'd spread a map across the hood of a patrol SUV. The paper fluttered in the cold breeze corners, pinned down with flashlights and a pair of gloves. The sergeant traced a finger along the winding blue line of Old Salmon River Road while explaining which areas crews would check first. His breath formed thin clouds that dissolved almost instantly, and I found myself watching those clouds as if they were signals fate had sent that only I could read. He pointed to the last recorded point from the app, Mile 17, just at the edge of a stretch known for its blind curves and steep drop-offs. Several officers exchanged a glance at that. Not fear exactly, but something close. They loaded into vehicles, engines rumbling awake. The convoy pulled out of our street like a slow-moving river of steel and urgency. I stood on the curb, hugging my arms tightly to keep warm, though warmth wasn't what I was really missing. The taillights disappeared into the soft gray morning, and the quiet that followed felt unnatural, like the town itself was holding its breath. I didn't know where to be, so I ended up trailing the last cruiser toward the staging area near the river. The parking lot there was already filling with trucks, some from the sheriff's office, some belonging to locals who recognized Lucas's name and showed up without being asked. The gravel was wet under my shoes, and the cold worked its way up my legs. A search coordinator unfolded a larger map across the bed of a pickup, while volunteers wrapped orange vests around their jackets. Their breath rose in pale plumes, merging with the mist that drifted down from the ridge. They divided into groups, each assigned a section of road or a slice of forest. One team moved uphill with walking sticks in hand, their boots crunching on last year's fallen needles. Others walked the narrow shoulders of the road, heads bent low as they scanned for anything, a tire skid, a broken branch, a lost water bottle. A pair of handlers brought out search dogs, their leashes taut, as the animals pulled forward noses close to the damp earth. The dogs barked once or twice, high-pitched and anxious, before settling into a determined pace. I followed one group for a while, climbing up a muddy slope that led into thicker timber. Ferns brushed against my jeans, leaving dark streaks of moisture. Every sound seemed magnified, the snap of a twig under someone's boot. the quiet static of a radio, the rhythmic dripping of water from the canopy overhead. At one point, someone called out that they'd found a piece of fabric and every head turned sharply. But it was just a fragment from an old tarp, bleached and frayed. One of the volunteers held it up, letting it dangle in his gloved hand before shaking his head and dropping it back on the ground. The disappointment hit harder than it should have. As the morning stretched toward midday, more searchers arrived, cyclists who knew the route well, hikers familiar with the back trails, even a couple of loggers who'd spent half their lives in those hills. They moved slowly, methodically, calling his name in even tones that barely carried through the dense forest. Their voices faded quickly, swallowed by moss and distance. A drone team unpacked their equipment near the command tent, the steady whir of propellers rising as the first unit lifted into the air. I watched it climb a small black shape against the pale sky and felt a strange mix of hope and dread. The drone's camera scanned the ravines and slopes, casting its mechanical gaze over areas too steep for people to reach easily. Every few minutes, the operator would murmur something under his breath, adjusting the angle or zoom, and the tension around him tightened. But each time he exhaled through his nose, soft and disappointed, the group around him knew nothing there. Carol called around lunchtime. Her voice shook when she said she'd booked the next flight out. I told her I'd meet her at the airport. She said she couldn't sit still another minute, that she kept refreshing the tracking data, even though she knew it wouldn't change. I could hear the clink of dishes behind her, maybe her husband trying to keep his hands busy while she talked. She asked if anyone had found a sign, anything at all. I told her the truth, the woods had given us nothing. Silence is an answer, but it's never the one you want. Rumors started popping up almost immediately. One volunteer said cyclists sometimes went off-road without meaning to, slipping on wet pavement or overcorrecting on curves. Another talked about wildlife, the possibility of an animal encounter. A third insisted he'd seen a suspicious truck on the road last week, something dark and boxy, but he couldn't recall a plate or even the make. The deputies listened to all of it, jotting down what they could, discarding what didn't fit. Their expressions never betrayed what they were thinking, but the fact they stayed so quiet made my mind churn with possibilities I didn't want to consider. People drifted around the staging area in nervous clusters. Some whispered about narrow shoulders and blind hills. Others murmured about past accidents in the area, how the mountains didn't forgive mistakes. A few mentioned hearing about strange encounters, cars that lingered behind cyclists too long, engines that idled on lonely stretches, figures glimpsed on back roads. No one claimed to know anything for sure, and maybe they didn't. But the uncertainty spread like fog, settling into conversations and looks exchanged over steaming cups of bad coffee. A deputy approached me mid-afternoon asking if Lucas had ever mentioned taking an alternate route. His voice was gentle, but the question hit like a slap. I told him no. Lucas planned his rides down to the last mile. He didn't improvise. The deputy nodded, staring off toward the ridge as though trying to picture every possible turn a rider could take. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat, and tiny droplets of mist dotted the shoulders of his jacket. When he walked away, I caught the soft scrape of gravel under his boots, the sound lingering a moment too long in the air. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped enough that people started pulling on thicker gloves, rubbing their hands together near portable heaters. A thin drizzle began to fall, tapping softly on the tailgates of trucks and darkening patches of dirt. The map on the hood of the sergeant's vehicle was now filled with colored markers, most of them marking places that had already been searched, some twice. Each time a team returned, boots muddied and voices low, the sergeant would ask for updates. And each time the answer was the same, nothing. The hours blurred after that. The sun slid behind the ridge, turning the sky a muted shade of steel. Radios crackled with coordinates, but the voices on them sounded tired. The forest grew darker by degrees, shadows deepening under the trees until the searchers' headlamps bobbed faintly between the trunks like wandering fireflies. I sat on the edge of a folding chair, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, the steam long gone. Every few minutes, I'd lift my head expecting the sight of someone walking toward me with news. But the only movement came from volunteers returning for supplies, their faces set in frustrated lines. At one point, a handler brought his dog to rest near the heater. The dog's fur was damp, and its chest rose and fell in tired breaths. I crouched nearby, listening to that steady rhythm, wishing it could somehow settle my own. The handler offered a small sympathetic smile before turning his attention back to the radio clipped to his vest. A soft burst of static came through, followed by a string of coordinates I didn't understand. As darkness settled fully around us, the sergeant walked from truck to truck, checking on the teams and quietly marking which areas would need fresh eyes in the morning. His flashlight cast long beams across the ground, illuminating clusters of leaves, patches of mud, and the reflective tape on vests. The cold settled deeper into my bones. The whole scene felt suspended, every person waiting, every sound magnified, every unanswered question unspooling in slow, painful silence. I was staring at the map again, tracing the blue line with numb fingers, when a sudden shift in tone rippled through the staging area. It wasn't loud, just a subtle tightening, a murmur passing between a few deputies near the far edge of the lot. One of them raised his radio, listening intently. Another stepped closer, brows drawn the beam of his flashlight, catching the mist as it drifted through the air. Then a call came through, low and steady, the words absorbed quickly by those around me. The sergeant straightened, motioned for a deputy to bring him something. A small cluster formed around the hood of his SUV. I couldn't hear what they were saying, not clearly, but I could see the way their bodies angled inward, the way their voices dropped. Something had changed, just enough to shift the air around us. And when the sergeant lifted his head and looked in my direction, I felt it in my chest like a slow, heavy drumbeat. Something new had come in over the radio. Something they hadn't expected. But no one said what it was. Not yet. The shift came late on the third afternoon, just as the light began to thin behind the ridge and the cold settled deeper into the clearing where we'd set up base. I remember standing near a portable heater, warming my hands through my sleeves when a clipped burst came over one of the radios. It wasn't loud, but it carried a tone I hadn't heard before, tight, urgent, stripped of the usual calm. Several deputies froze mid-step. The sergeant, who'd spent the day moving from group to group like a man trying to plug holes in a sinking ship, lifted his head sharply. Another transmission followed, more insistent this time, and I watched the color drain from faces around me in the soft gray dusk. A deputy jogged toward the sergeant, mud spattering from his boots, radio still in his fist. The two spoke quickly, leaning close, the red beam of the deputy's headlamp cutting across the map on the hood of the SUV. Their breath fogged in the cold air, blending together and disappearing before the wind could take it. I didn't hear the words, just saw the way shoulders straightened and the quiet ripple of people adjusting their gear. Something had been found. No one said it out loud yet, but the silence tightened like a rope being pulled from both ends. The sergeant called for a smaller team, 3 deputies, 1 handler, and a ranger who'd spent half her life in those woods. They moved with purpose, gathering ropes, lights, first aid packs, and the heavy canvas bags they kept in the back of the trucks. One of the deputies stepped toward me and asked that I stay behind. His voice was soft, steady, but his eyes flickered away as soon as he spoke. That was enough to make my stomach turn cold. People look you in the eye when they're hopeful. They look past you when they're afraid of what comes next. I stood there as they headed toward 2 trucks idling at the edge of the clearing, engines rumbling low in the evening air. The headlights carved long paths through the trees, lighting the wet trunks and the fine mist drifting between them. The forest swallowed the light quickly, the beams thinning into pale ribbons before fading altogether. When the trucks pulled out, gravel snapped under their tires, sharp, brittle sounds that echoed longer than they should have. And then they were gone. The rest of us waited, Some pretended to busy themselves with equipment checking straps or wiping mud from their boots. Others stood still, eyes fixed on the narrow road leading up the mountain. Radios stayed on, but quiet hissing softly with static. The drizzle came back lightly, tapping on the metal roof of the command trailer, a faint, persistent tapping that made my skin tighten. Every breath felt colder. Every minute felt stretched. After what couldn't have been more than 20 minutes, though it felt like an hour, one of the radios crackled again. The sergeant stepped closer, tilting his head toward the speaker. His jaw tightened, then released, then tightened again. Without saying anything, he grabbed his jacket collar and signaled for the medic unit to stand by. That was the moment a slow dread seeped through my arms and chest as if someone had poured ice water beneath my ribs. I moved closer to the map table, gripping the edge of it until my knuckles went white. No one told me to stop. Maybe they knew at that point that nothing they said would change where I needed to be. From somewhere down the logging road came the distant thump of truck doors closing, followed by the faint crackle of boots moving fast across wet ground. Flashlights swung through the trees, their beams slicing the shadows into pieces. A ranger emerged first, her jeans smeared with mud nearly up to her knees. She didn't speak right away. She pulled off one glove with her teeth breathing hard and wiped rain from her face with the back of her hand. The sergeant asked her something low. She nodded once, slow, deliberate, and that single gesture took the air out of my lungs. She reached into her pack and handed him a small evidence pouch. I couldn't see what was inside, but I heard the soft clink of plastic against plastic. The sergeant's shoulders dipped barely, but enough that anyone watching could see the weight of whatever he was holding settle onto him. He motioned to two deputies, and they stepped toward me. Their boots left dark prints across the gravel. One of them spoke gently, saying they'd found something off an old spur trail, something they needed to verify. My legs went cold and heavy at the same time. I followed them without really feeling the ground under my feet. The forest closed in quickly. The air grew cooler as we moved under thicker canopy, the smell of wet earth rising around us. Ferns brushed my calves, their fronds slick and cold. The deputies kept their flashlights low, watching the ground. The only sounds were the steady crunch of our steps, the distant rush of a swollen stream, and my own breathing shaky and uneven. We reached a narrow trail barely wider than a deer path. Fresh footprints marked the mud searcher's prints, but deeper impressions led down a slope the kind made by someone carrying weight or moving slowly. The ranger waited partway down, her light pointing at something just beyond a fallen log. The deputies slowed, and I felt my heart thudding so hard it pushed against the inside of my ribs. I saw the helmet first. It lay on its side in a shallow ditch streaked with mud and covered with a film of green algae, as though it had been sitting through days of rain. The small camera mounted on top was spattered with dirt, the lens beaded with moisture. A faint glow blinked weakly through the grime. That little pulse of red light flickered like it was trying to breathe. My knees nearly gave out. The ranger stepped closer, careful where she placed her boots. She pointed to the ground beyond the helmet-disturbed soil, crushed ferns, and a faint drag line disappearing into thicker brush. I didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. I felt the truth hollow out the space behind my ribs. A forensic tech knelt beside the helmet, bracing one hand on the slick moss-covered log. The forest was quiet except for the faint patter of rain dripping off needles overhead. He lifted the helmet with a gloved hand and turned it over gently. The camera remained attached, the casing scratched but intact. He tapped its side once. No response. He tapped again. The tiny red light blinked one last time before fading away. My breath caught in my throat. It felt like watching the last spark of someone's voice go silent. They placed the helmet in an evidence bag and sealed it with a slow, careful motion. The deputies shifted, making room. I stepped back instinctively, hands shaking, chest tight. I kept staring at that patch of disturbed earth, terrified of what lay beyond it, and equally terrified of not knowing. The ranger and two deputies followed the drag line deeper into the brush. Their lights disappeared behind a curtain of ferns and shadows. The rest of us waited in a kind of suspended breath. Even the rain seemed to hold off for a moment, the drops falling more softly, as if the forest itself understood what was unfolding. A shout came a minute later, not loud but sharp enough to cut through the trees. Every muscle in my body seized. The sergeant moved forward, pushing aside branches with one gloved hand. I followed, though I barely remember my feet moving. They'd found a bike lodged halfway down a steep ravine, wedged between a fallen cedar and a tangle of roots. The frame was bent sharply, the wheels twisted in on themselves like broken wings. Mud clung to the metal in thick layers, masking most of the surface. A deputy leaned over the edge with a long pole, testing the stability of the ground before climbing down. The bike had not crashed there by accident. It had been thrown. While the deputies documented the bike, the ranger called the sergeant over to another spot, a patch of soil that had clearly been disturbed days earlier, the top layer washed away by recent rain. She pointed to fractures in the undergrowth, the irregular pattern of flattened ferns. I couldn't see everything from where I stood, but I understood enough. Someone had carried something heavy off the road down the slope and into the trees. They widened the search area around that point. The forest grew darker as night crept in, headlamps flickering like fireflies. Radios crackled. Commands were murmured. The air thickened with a kind of quiet dread. And then, after several long, unbearable minutes, another call came through. Low, final. One that made every person within earshot stop moving. Human remains. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They hung in the damp air like a dark stain spreading outward. My legs buckled and I dropped to a crouch, one hand sinking into the cold, wet leaves. I felt the chill climb up through my arm. My breath hitched, stuttered, then broke. Someone placed a hand on my shoulder, steady and warm, but I barely registered the weight. The world had narrowed to the sound of my own pulse, a slow, pounding ache inside my skull. They moved with solemn precision after that. Lights arranged, ground marked, a perimeter established. Every sound grew hushed. Even the forest seemed to soften, the wind moving gently through the branches overhead. I watched as deputies worked with respectful, measured steps, the beam of their flashlights catching glimpses of fabric bone and soil. I turned away when my breath began to shake again, pressing a hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound. The medical examiner arrived shortly after, his voice low as he conferred with the sergeant. The conversation was brief. The confirmation came quietly. It was Lucas, and time nature had taken its toll. But there was enough to understand what had happened. Blunt force impacts consistent with being struck by a vehicle, injuries suggesting he'd been moved after the collision, and signs he had survived for hours before succumbing to the cold and trauma alone in that ravine. The cause wasn't just an accident. Someone had forced him off that road. Later that night, back at the sheriff's office, I sat in a small interview room wrapped in a blanket someone had handed me. The walls were pale, the overhead lights too bright, and I kept my eyes on the table to avoid the emptiness in the room. Detectives moved quietly outside the door. Phones rang in short bursts. A printer hummed somewhere down the hall. I felt hollow. Not numb hollow, like something inside me had been scooped out cleanly. Across the hallway, I saw the sergeant speaking with the tech who'd sealed the helmet. They both looked tired. Old. The kind of tired that sits deep in a person's bones. Someone handed me water. Another handed me tissues. I thanked them without hearing my own voice. A deputy came in near midnight and told me they'd recovered the footage from the camera. He didn't describe it. He didn't have to. His eyes carried the weight of it, and he lowered them when mine met his. Outside, a press conference was being prepared. Officials were gathering statements. The parking lot glowed with floodlights, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. Somewhere beyond those lights, the town was quiet, unaware of how much had changed. I sat there listening to the faint murmur of voices and the soft hum of fluorescent lights, knowing that nothing would ever return to the shape it had before. and the long night ahead would only be the beginning of what waited next. In the hours after the recovery site was secured, everything around me moved in a kind of muffled rhythm, as if the world had wrapped itself in thick cotton. The sheriff's office filled with the soft sounds of printers, radios, quiet footsteps, and doors clicking shut. No one raised their voice. No one hurried. People carried the weight of the news in their posture in the way they held their clipboards tighter than necessary, or spoke in shorter phrases than usual. I sat in a chair near the end of a long hallway, a blanket around my shoulders, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above me. The air smelled like damp boots and strong coffee, and I kept pressing my thumb into the edge of the paper cup in my hands, trying to anchor myself to something that didn't move. When Carol and Dennis arrived, the hallway changed. Their faces carried that mix of disbelief and dread that no family should ever have to wear. Carol leaned against me, her forehead touching my temple, her breath unsteady as she repeated, "I'm here, I'm here," as if she needed to convince herself of it. Dennis stood a few feet back, jaw clenched, his hand resting on the back of a chair as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. The detectives brought them into a separate room. When the door closed behind them, the thin glass rattled just a little, and that tiny sound made my throat tighten. The next morning news of the discovery reached town before the sun was fully up. By the time I stepped outside, the air already carried that hushed heaviness that settles over a community after tragedy. Neighbors lingered on porches with their arms folded across their chests. The woman who owned the coffee shop across the street placed a small vase of flowers near her doorway, her eyes soft but filled with a question she didn't know how to ask. Even the seagulls circling above the roofs seemed quieter, drifting more than crying. The investigation intensified overnight. Federal agents arrived with their dark jackets and measured tones, carrying cases of equipment into the sheriff's building. The footage from the helmet camera had revealed more than anyone expected, and a team of specialists spent hours analyzing every grainy reflection and muffled sound. They played sections over and over, adjusting filters, listening for anything that might identify the voice, the engine, the background noise. Their work was silent from the outside, just the occasional low murmur behind closed doors, but each hour they spent in there etched more unease into the faces of the deputies who walked the hallway. When they finally emerged, the news was grim. The vehicle that had struck Lucas was a dark SUV, an older model, likely American-made. The voice captured in the faint audio belonged to a man calm and steady, a tone that suggested experience rather than panic. They couldn't pull a license plate from the reflection, couldn't identify the driver, and the terrain had swallowed any tire prints long before the search began. The sense of helplessness that settled over the room was palpable, a cold draft that seemed to work its way beneath jackets and sink into bones. Soon after, information started trickling in from beyond Lincoln City. A hiker recognized details in the news, the style of helmet, the location, and called in about an incident 2 summers earlier at a state park. That tip led investigators north, where a long-forgotten report about an abandoned helmet opened an older missing cyclist case. The day they confirmed the pattern, I remember sitting at my kitchen table watching the steam rise from a cup of tea I never drank, listening as the detective explained that there had been another disappearance, and that the bicycle from that case had been found lodged under a pile of brush just like Lucas's. The officer chose his words carefully, but the implication was clear. Whatever happened to Lucas had happened before. The community absorbed that revelation with a mix of horror and disbelief. Cyclists who once rode alone now traveled in pairs, reflective vests glowing along the morning roads. The bike shop downtown started offering free safety checks, their windows filled with posters urging caution. Group rides formed overnight, and strangers who might never have spoken to each other began exchanging routes, times check-in points. Fear had a way of rearranging routines, tightening circles, sharpening instincts. As for me, I couldn't bring myself to drive the mountain road again. Even passing the turnoff on the highway made my chest constrict. The air around that stretch felt different now, colder, heavier, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I moved through the days, slowly sorting through his gear one piece at a time. His shoes by the door. The repair kit he always kept stocked. The jersey folded neatly on the shelf, still carrying the faint scent of detergent. I held each item longer than I meant to, my fingertips tracing seams and zippers, trying to memorize textures I already knew by heart. When his belongings were eventually released, the box felt impossibly light. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, lay the helmet he'd worn that morning. The camera had been removed for analysis, leaving an empty mount that looked like an eye that had been closed forever. I didn't open the bag containing what remained of the camera. Some things I learned were not meant to be revisited. Law enforcement kept the case open. They followed leads across counties, interviewed drivers who matched the general description, checked vehicles with suspicious damage. Tips came in waves, some hopeful, others far-fetched, most dead ends. There were days when the detectives sounded energized, their voices brisk and clipped as they updated me, and other days their words grew slower, weighed down by the lack of progress. A case can remain active without ever truly moving. Months passed. Seasons changed. The fog that settles along the coast in autumn returned thick and white, blurring the outlines of houses and street lamps. I packed up the apartment slowly, the sounds of the ocean following me through every room. I donated most of his cycling gear to a youth program in town, the bright jerseys, the spare helmet, the gloves with worn palms. The director of the program promised they'd be put to good use, and I believed her. It felt right for those items to carry someone forward, even if it couldn't be him. I kept one camera, though. Not the one from that morning. The other one, the one he used at home to film casual videos, gear reviews, little moments he found funny or interesting. Sometimes I power it on just to see his face light up on the tiny screen, his voice filling the quiet of whatever room I'm standing in. There's a video where he talks about why he loves long climbs, his hands moving animatedly, as if the air itself needed convincing. I watch that clip more than I mean to. The corners of the frame flicker a little. The microphone distorts when he laughs, but it feels like he's still in the room, his presence warm and alive. The town changed after his death, though not in dramatic ways. The local sheriff's office added new protocols for reporting overdue cyclists. The trailheads posted more signage. People started recognizing each other on rides, exchanging nods, sometimes stopping to chat about road conditions or the weather pushing in from offshore. Even those who didn't know him still talk about him with a kind of protective tenderness, as if his story became part of the landscape they all share. As for me, the sharp edges of those early days softened with time, though they never disappeared. They sit in me like polished stones, heavy, smooth, always present. I learned to speak about him without my voice breaking, learned how to carry the ache without letting it dictate every hour. But some images still rise unbidden, the flickering red light of that camera, the way the forest looked that night, the way the sergeant's expression changed when he realized what they'd found. Those memories live in me the way old injuries do, quiet most days, but unmistakable when the weather shifts. Sometimes I think about the road he loved so much, the way the morning light cuts through the trees in thin golden strips, the way the pavement hums under thin tires. There's beauty up there still untouched and stubborn, and I hope people keep riding it. I hope they feel the joy he did, the freedom he talked about in that final video. The mountains held his last moments, but they also held so many of his happiest hours. I try to remember that. In the end, the echo that remains is not just grief. It's the understanding that lives are built from small routines, shared glances, quiet mornings, and the roads we choose to travel. And even when those roads end in ways we never imagined, the love carried along them doesn't vanish. It lingers in the air, in the memories, in the way the world felt before everything changed. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel, so these stories are never forgotten.